Hello and welcome back to the latest Hive tutorial. Now, we've already created ourselves a scene node worker, and we want to create ourselves a object worker which gets an object from the scene. This is part of our Blender game engine workers. So what we can do is go back into our Hive worker graphical user interface. I'm going to close all my windows and open up again so you can see what I'm doing. Worker GUI. And we want to do the following. To get an object, you need a scene. So let's give ourselves an input antenna, pull antenna, and set the type to object, kx underscore scene. And that's we're gonna call this in the general tab. I'm gonna call this scene in. Or just call it scene actually for now. Now what we need to do is we need to create the name of the object we're going to access, and this is going to be pull antenna underscore string. We can call this called object or object name, and update the ID. And we have two pull inputs. Now what we need to do is create an output. And the output will be pull output. We're going to set the type to object, kx underscore game object. For those of you who are already familiar with Python, I'm using the names of the objects, the classes for the game objects. And now we have an output, and we're going to call this object out. Now, one thing that's important to remember is the names of all of these workers in Hive GUI are the names that you access them in the code and the ones you see on the outside of the worker itself. So if you call an input object name, that's what you'll see in the worker on the graphical user interface, and likewise that's what you access it with. For those of you who are familiar with Python, this is used as the locals dictionary. So, as before, we have to create a variable that we can output from. So give ourselves a variable. We'd set the type to, again, object, kx underscore game object, and create an instance. Connect the output. That should connect. At least I have an extra capital B, which is why it wasn't liking it. And then connect now, hopefully. Again, it doesn't like it, so we have to check why that is. Of course, very easy. Object. Hopefully I've fixed it now. And now go to General tab, and segment profile will set to full again. Now we can see the pre-output. So we're going to create ourselves a modifier again. Connect the pre-output to the trigger. And in the modifier, we're going to now have to trigger the updating of the input values, but we need to use a buffer again. Rather than using a transistor and a variable, we can simply use a buffer. So let's use a pull buffer, because we need one. And one is going to be a string, which will be the top one. I'm going to call this buffer get name even, and going to create a parameter trigger function which will be called to trigger this get updating the name. Get name. No, actually update name. And that should be saved. Now I'm going to create us another pull buffer, and this type is going to be object, kx underscore scene. So get a scene input and connect it to the scene. I'm going to call this buffer get scene. I'm going to take the trigger function as update underscore scene. And now, if we go into our modifier, we can say, because we must have a scene and an object input, object name, and what we don't need to worry about errors for now. Self.update name, self.update scene. I think that's what we called them. That's not right. It hasn't saved the trigger functions. Let's have a look. Update name. Update scene. Okay. And now name equals self.getName, and scene equals scene underscore name. Sorry, scene equals self.getScene. And you'll see that the get scene and get name refers to these buffers which store the value, and these functions call the updating functions which trigger these buffers. to pull the value from the inputs. So now what we have to do is the following. Object or obj equals scene.objects name. So get the object. Now self.object out equals obj. Now that's done. So if we save as into our workers as we did before, Hive example, go to start point, go into workers, and type get object.workWeb, and now generate the code. Copy the code and open your text editor. Paste it and save it in the same place, the workers folder. Get object.py. We have ourselves a way of getting a game object. Now let's create a worker for reading the property of a game object. So we go back to our worker GUI, which is probably been closed. No, here it is. File, new. We're going to create an input, a pull input, push or pull antenna. We're going to set it as kx game object, takes a game object input, and we set the name to object, or game underscore object perhaps. The name won't be quite right, but it doesn't matter. And we get ourselves a buffer, as per usual. It's up here, and it'll be a pull buffer. Type object, comma kx underscore game object. And you see here I've done something very stupid, and I need to set the type as object, comma kx game object in the other one. Connect them together, and I rename the pull buffer to object or game. No, object instance. Whatever you think is nice. We set the trigger func to get obj. Get obj. I've hit enter to make sure it's entered. Now the output is going to have to be a string. Well, actually, the output will have to be a specific type, depending on the input. So for now, what we'll do is we'll assume that the output of the variable will always be a string, so for printing it. So we'll set the push output string, or a pull output string for now. We're only using pulls because, and there's a reason for this. And we'll set this to value, and I've removed the panel. Now we create ourselves a variable string, connect the inputs and create a trigger function, or rather get the pre-update trigger. Now we're going to create a modifier as we did last time. Connect the trigger to pre-output. So before outputs we call this modifier, which is code. Import the BG, and now we're going to do the following. We need to the object. We need to get the object. So self.gameObject or get object, or might be self.getObj. Yes, getObj. And run that. Now we're going to have to get an input to get the property name. We need to know what property we're looking for. So if a pull input, we've got to add a pull input string. No, pull antenna string. I'm going to call this prop name, update ID. Create ourselves a buffer, a pull buffer string. Connect it. Set the trigger func to get prop, and set the name of the buffer to prop putty underscore name. We're using a similar name to before. The modifier will now set self.getObj, self.getProp, as seen here. Now, output equals str, make a string, self.object instance. I'm going to access the property. We're not going to catch any errors here. We're going to assume that it must exist. Now self dot rename the variable output to prop value, and self dot prop value equals output. Now we're going to save this file, save as, and Hive example, start point, workers, and we call this get prop.py. Oh no, my bad. Let me go back into our folder, workers, and rename get prop.py to get prop.workerweb. Now we're going to click Ctrl G. It won't work in this case, so we need to close it and open it again. If it doesn't show up, that means it's running an error and you need to close and open it again for now. File, open. It gets tedious typing in the file path each time. And we're going to open up our get prop worker web and get a Ctrl G to generate. Copy the code, and then create a new Python file, save it as get prop.py, and now we're ready to use it. So let's go into Hive GUI. Close all our worker webs. Hive GUI.py. We're going to open our test web. Start point, which is tester.web. Go into the workers and open all the subdirectories. Add a get scene, get prop, and get object. We're going to connect the scene output to the scene input on the get object. We're going to go to Dragonfly, it's std for standard, add a variable, go to the parameter tab and set it to str for string, connect that to the object name, and we're going to call this variable cube, or set the value to cube even. This will get us the default scene, hopefully. Now the object, we connect the object out to the game object get prop. We're going to copy this variable, connect it to the prop name, and set the variable value to prop, all lowercase. Now I'm going to go to IO, watch, set type to string. In fact, no, delete. Yes, watch and set type to string. And if you set it to, it's interesting, how would I do this? It's probably best. No, we won't. Delete that. Add a transistor, parameters, and set the type to string. Connect the input to get prop. Now go to IO, add a tick sensor, connect the output to the transistor, and now add a display, set the type to string, and connect the output on the transistor to the display. Now how does this all work? Every tick we trigger a pulse here. This triggers the transistor to pull the value from get prop, which gets the property of a game object. This requests the game object name, property name from this variable, and the game object value from this node. This node, to get the game object value, has to get the name of the object, which is cube, and the scene, which then goes to the scene node and requests the scene from the scene name or the current scene if it fails. So we now save this, go to Blender, and let's test if it works. Add prop and set it to a string, and we'll type testing. Now hit P. Let's see if we've got any errors. We do have an error. It might be that it hasn't saved correctly. Let's try this out. File, save as. I don't think it's saved correctly. Open up start point, and test.web and save it. Now run this. We still have an error. And after some debugging, I've realised the reason for this. Theoretically, in our get object worker map, we need to change the modifier self.variable_1 equals obj. That is the reason that we have the issue. So, after saving that, if I can generate the code, update the save object code, which is here, And now go to the BGE and see what happens when we run it. And you'll see we have some debug code. The scene specifier doesn't exist, it's fine, that's just getting the default scene. We'll see it says prep, that's me adding in a debug statement, and testing now works, and it prints testing. If I say testing 1, 2, 3, you'll see it goes testing 1, 2, 3, hopefully. Boom. Testing 1, 2, 3. So, that's all for today's tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll be going over this more comprehensively and explaining how this all works. But this just gets you into the workflow. Thank you for watching. Enjoy.